If there's one thing that's the most important in this nutrient series, I believe it's probably understanding the stages of reefing, what I'll call the new reefer mentor paradox. Meaning new reefers are obviously looking for ways to set up a brand new tank as well as solve some of those inevitable problems that most of us have faced in the first few months or even years. They do that by looking to the mentors, those of us that have actually gone through all those problems before, solved them, and then produced a thriving reef tank that others can emulate. But I'll be frank, I've seen this many times. The most experienced of us often forget about where we were and we're focused on where we are today, and we miss the entire journey in between and who's actually asking this question. And in relation to nutrients or nitrate and phosphate, this is probably one of the more important aspects because as a 5 or even 10-year reefer, nutrients, nitrate and phosphate, really aren't that big of a factor to my tank, but way back in the beginning, in those first few months, they were. In a relatively new tank, there isn't a lot of competition for nitrate and phosphate because I don't have many corals in the tank, meaning it's just building up a battery for pests. I also don't have the coralline algae coverage or microfauna population that protects against many pests or algae, and I actually want my corals to grow up faster, calcify faster, and fill out the tank. So in a new tank, it just matters a lot more than it does 5 years from now. So solving that paradox is as simple as understanding it's the newer reefers who are asking and it's the established reefers that are answering, and we should focus those answers on the beginning of the journey rather than the end. And if we do this right, it will change the trajectory of this person's tank and also accept a little bit of the responsibility that comes with sharing knowledge. Starting with that first stage or first tank, the primary goal here is I just don't want to fail. Meaning a year from now, I want to look back and see a thriving reef tank and know this hobby is for me. That means avoiding common algae and pests that are in new tanks, supporting biodiversity that helps with that. The corals and fish aren't dying, and it wasn't overwhelmingly difficult to achieve. And in terms of nitrate and phosphate, it doesn't have to be difficult. Just test 12 times a year, that's once a month, and it'll give you a pulse onto whether or not you're trending up or trending down, and then just fix those trends. Shoot for a goal of somewhere between 1 and 5 parts per million nitrate, and with phosphate, above 0, but below 0.1. Staying within those ranges will help manage many of those goals we just mentioned. Also, it fits a skill set appropriate for doing this for your first time. We're not playing mad scientists here trying to peg a specific number, which is a more advanced skill set. And through your monthly tests, if you see that the nitrate and phosphate levels are trending up or rising, you can fix that by just feeding less. Most of the nitrate and phosphate that you're adding to the tank is coming from your food, so if you just stop putting so much food in the tank, it'll actually correct that trend. And if needed, there are also bigger solutions out there like medias that can strip out the phosphate from the tank. You can use GFO, lanthanum chloride, or phosphate E if you like. But those are more of a hammer, and in the beginning stages of a reefing, just adjusting the nutrients by the amount of food you put in is probably easier. In fact, you can go the other way. If you find the trend is that you're going closer to 0,0 and not having enough nutrients in the tank, you can just feed more. So that next stage are a few years of reefing, and probably many of the people that are watching this, the goals are just different. We've got past those initial hurdles. Let's fill out this tank faster, primarily by stopping the phosphate from inhibiting calcification. Let's make sure that we maintain phosphate levels fairly low so we don't slow down growth and calcification. Let's also avoid longer-term pitfalls. A lot of the poor decisions that you make in the first few months don't actually show up until the first few years. So you see these things accumulate over many years. Let's start to identify what they are and solve them. At this point, it's probably becoming more apparent that elevated nutrients or nitrate and phosphate are not just pollutants themselves, but also indicative of a wide range of pollutants that are probably building up in the tank right along with them. If our filtration approach isn't enough to remove the nitrate and phosphate, it's likely that other pollutants are building up over time as well, and we just can't test for them. So that's one of the realities of reefing. There's all kinds of things that we don't know, we can't test for, and we just may never know, but we still have to deal with them and look for those pulses that tell us how. So nutrients is one of them. It gives us that overall pulse of pollution, specifically pollution that comes in with the foods that we input to the tank. It's not just nitrogen and phosphorus. So if we look for those things and have an approach to an overall unpolluted tank, we'll probably reduce the amount of stress-based mortalities that happens in our tank. Some of those mortalities you just didn't know how they happened, but they're probably coming from some environmental factors, some irritants combined with other stressors in the tank. Let's just remove as many of those as possible. So if you do that, you'll probably make it onto that next stage or journey in reefing, which is that 5 or 10-year tank where knowledge really isn't holding you back, and certainly not knowledge in relation to nutrients or nitrate and phosphate, because they just don't matter as much in this type of established tank. If you've made it this far, slow coral growth probably isn't your problem. In fact, it's actually the opposite in many cases, where the corals are now growing too fast and filling up the tank, and constantly pruning them is now the biggest problem. Algae or other pests are probably not a problem in this established tank. Coralline algae coverage is everywhere. Biological diversity has been established. Stability and bleaching just isn't as big of an issue because most of the other challenges have been solved. So controlling that zooxanthellae population, just really not as important in an established tank like this. Coloration, maybe, if you're really trying to tune that nitrogen and phosphorus and zooxanthellae population to a specific goal. But this is an end game goal, somebody who's been doing this for a long time, looking for something very specific, an advanced approach to reefing. But this is the most important note here for those of us that have made it to this stage with this 5 and 10-year tank, where many of the things in relation to nutrients just don't matter, or they seem like an afterthought. We have to remember that paradox and that we are the mentors, and so when people ask us for advice, we have to roll back in our minds and remember the entire journey, what helped us be successful in the beginning, not just where we are at today. But the best part of this hobby is there's no single path, no right or best way, just different journeys that lead to relatively the same place, just different amounts of effort, some pain points, and sometimes different levels of success, but all a mix of science, experience, and personal beliefs. So my personal beliefs on my own tanks coming up next.